Welcome back, nature viewers, to another episode of Brady's National Geographic. And as this pleasant breeze is flowing by right now, I feel a little bit excited about today, with the weather and everything. Although I do know that this week it's probably going to skyrocket back up to 179. So if that ever happens, don't worry, I can always just dip in the ice chest for a little bit. But I don't know how long that will last, so we'll see what happens. But yeah, if you guys saw last week's episode, which I'm surprised I couldn't make one, in the middle of the week. But if you saw last week's episode, you know that I introduced a new feature, which is the Geographic part in National Geographic. We've already talked about a lot of things that happen within nature, but now it's time to actually explore more around the world, other than, just being outside in general, which, that I'm not trying to disencourage you to do that. You should still be going outside, but you should also know a little bit more about the outside world, or the world in general. But yeah, we did talk about Russia because it was one of the most powerful countries within one of the most powerful continents, Asia, or I guess I should say biggest. I don't want to really start any controversies here. Today we're going to continue in the continent of Asia. We're probably going to keep on going with countries that are in there until we find ones that, okay, maybe we might not talk about these because they don't really seem like they're as important to other ones out there, but they still are nonetheless. We are going to be talking about China today. Apart from Russia also being one that stretches from Asia to Europe, we're going to be talking about China because it tends to be one that really is big and kind of almost a little bit smart too. Maybe a little bit too much. Also, just a quick side note, I want you to remember that we also have our little mini bug or insect series going along too, meaning that I will never run out of ideas again. The only way I kind of technically would run out of ideas is thinking about how I want to do these geography or history type of videos combined into one. I want to write a list on how I want to make this series. Because I also don't want to, start with, like I said, we started with Russia, which, was a really good start, though. I'm not saying that is bad, but I also don't want to, end with a country that's, pretty poor out there, or it doesn't really look like it gets talked about a lot, and most people would think, that's kind of a little bit boring. I don't really want to do that. I will switch it up every now and then. I still want to end on a banger too, while also starting on one. It's kind of like an album. You want to start on something good. You could probably have terrible stuff in the middle, but if it ends on a good note, then I'll still call it a good thing. So that's just a little something to keep in mind. But now let's go ahead and start talking about China. I didn't even notice this until now, but there literally is a dead wasp right here. I guess little bro had too much to smoke last night, and that's what you get! Hey, wait, I'm gonna make sure he never comes back after this. Okay, let's go. But yeah, just like before with our Russia video, we talked about 3 important things, and I kind of summarized it a little bit by talking about where we are at this point right now. And I feel like I'll probably just do that for every single geographic video, just so that way it picks up the pace a little bit, even though that I'm trying to get this down fast so this doesn't turn out the same length as the Russia video. But the 3 things I'll be talking about is China and their involvement with imperialism, their involvement with a few world wars, or any wars around, and their one-child policy, which is extremely dark. But let's go ahead and start. So starting off with imperialism, this was a point in time that every single country that was partaking in this action was becoming extremely strict. And this applied to China thanks to Britain, who brought along a drug called opium, and thus it started 2 different opium wars. Yes, 2 wars based on the same drug. One started in 1839, they both started in 1800, I should clarify that, but one started in 1839 and lasted for 3 years, while the other one also started in 1856 and lasted for 4 years. So even though there's a time skip, because of Britain, or because of foreign trade with them, then that's basically what happened. But unfortunately for China, they lost, which led to other countries like France and Japan starting to take over different sections of Asia. And by the 1890s, Europe was actually starting to take over Asia a little bit more, and all the money was actually going towards them. So it's kind of crazy to think about it now, since, seeing one of the smallest continents actually, be the king of the big continent, then, it felt like something that you probably would never see happen before. You would kind of think that it would be the other way around, even though that, I don't really think that's true. But that wasn't actually the full case on why, China was starting to have a downfall of its own. It also started because, people were mad because China wasn't really modernizing correctly. Since, because of this, it was introducing new technology, building railroads, and it was basically just the Industrial Revolution starting, since it was taking place in the 1890s. So because of their loss in a war that they tried to start and also end at the same time, it was really hard for China to really rebuild its back. So because of their loss in the war that they started and also tried to end at the same time, which didn't work out in their favor, and other countries also taking apart their land and seizing control because they had imperialism and they knew that China was starting to have its own downfall. And even between China and Japan, which was called the Sino-Japanese War, which, they failed again too, then it was really hard to, modernize themselves because everybody was complaining and wanting to. It's kind of almost the same thing as Russia. Like, they were trying to make their country really stand out, or like, stick out the way as everybody else was, but it just wasn't working out in their favor. And they knew that they had to just stay neutral as World War I was also starting. Also, just on a complete side note, the Chinese people, they were addicted to the drug, the opium thing that Britain was giving them. Yeah, that probably might have been the reason why they lost the war. That actually might be the reason why that wasp was dead over there. Anyways, though, in World War I, China, of course, initially remained neutral because they were trying to keep themselves together since, they already had experienced their downfall, and they were really trying to stay modernized within this time area, since this was where Industrial Revolution and the Great Depression were also starting to get up on their hands. But the young Republic of China eventually had to declare war on Germany and Austria-Hungary because their primary goals were to reclaim Germany-held territories in the Shandong Peninsula that Japan had occupied earlier within the war, and it was also to increase international standings. So instead of fighting, China actually contributed massive logistical manpower to the Chinese labor. So yeah, China did join the Allied powers, and their role in the Chinese Labor Corps was to perform essential dangerous support work that was meant to hopefully try to take as many people out as possible. And the way they were doing this was digging trenches, building roads, loading armaments, and clearing unexploded ordnance on the Western Front. And the sacrifices they made were at least 3,000 to 10,000 laborers died during the conflict from shelling, landmines, and the Spanish flu pandemic. And the transportation that they used along was, instead avoiding the German U-boats, the British secretly shipped tens of thousands of these men through Canada before sending them to Europe. So yeah, it worked out really well though. The aftermath of all this was, despite being on the winning side, China suffered a massive diplomatic betrayal at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference because the Western powers ignored China's request and allowed Japan to remain control on the Shandong Peninsula. So basically meaning they technically were in control because, I guess Taiwan was released, but China, they weren't really happy, even though that they, won the war, but they really weren't getting the treatment that they deserve. But, they helped win. As for World War II, the Second Sino-Japanese War, which was a devastating military conflict between the Republic of China and the Empire of Japan, was fought primarily in China, but also marked the beginning of World War II in Asia, and as a result, it led to catastrophic casualties, setting the stage for major post-war political realignments. So, it basically was like oh, here we go again. This was the start of another world war, even after, signing a peace treaty with all the, loser sides of the war in World War I. But yeah, this right here, you probably would have never expected this battle to actually be the start of World War II, but nonetheless it was. And finally, the last thing I'll be talking about for today, which is the darkest of them all, is China's one-child policy, as this was where it was starting to turn a little bit sexist. The reason the one-child policy started in the first place was because that the money wasn't being used right to help feed people along. And if you were having big families of 5 kids, 6 kids, or even 7 kids, which, I'm not gonna lie, but if you're having more than 5 kids out there, then that really is a lot of hard work there, isn't it, buddy? Okay, but the main reason why it was also turning sexist in this matter was because that if you were giving birth to a lot of girls, then, it kind of was hard to control, because girls, or I guess I should say women too, they can actually go on and marry other people, other men, and they join their families instead, and they don't actually become a part of your family anymore. And that's how real life works too. But in China, this was different, because if you were actually giving birth to a male, they can actually still carry on your family and everything. But once you have a girl instead, then they join a different family, because they're no longer going to be a part of yours, even though if they are technically, their last name, it gets changed to the males instead, because that's just how it works. However, the reason why it was also getting darker was from the fact that parents, they can't control, whether or not they have a boy or girl. You can't control that. Even if you were lucky enough to have a boy in that scenario, still, you can't control whether or not you have a boy or a girl in this time period too. It's literally luck-based. Kind of, but still, you should still love your child. At the end of the day, you should love your child equally for who they are, what they turned out as. Even if they weren't what you expected at the beginning, hey, you wanted a child, so it's what you got. You should still love them equally. But it was also getting darker too, because if you were a girl, most likely you probably were going to get killed. Yeah, they didn't have a problem with killing babies that were just because that they weren't boys. because that was like the thing that was living on though. Like if you weren't a girl, then it basically was hard to keep on the family tradition and everything. It was basically hard. Like even if you were able to live, but you had a brother, then they were basically putting everything for the brother. They were putting like their brother over you, which that feels like that doesn't really feel fair. Like that doesn't feel like, even though it's for the better, it's still like isn't better to see one child have to really like suffer, like have to live off their own, while the other one is really getting everything that they want. Like I've also hold on, I'm trying to speak here. I've read stories about how some people survived in that time period of living in the one-child policy era, but if they were like birthed as a girl, then most likely their parents would probably just like send them to the adoption center instead. They would send them to the orphanage, and that's actually what happened. A bunch of orphans eventually like had to go there, or because like their parents disowned them since they weren't boys, then a lot of them went over there instead, just to avoid them from getting killed, and also to avoid the mothers from being stabilized, because they also didn't have a problem with doing that too. Not only would they murder children, but they would also stabilize mothers, just because like they were going to be giving birth to girls, or because they already birthed girls, or they would probably like try to kill their families too. It was very dark in that era too, and it's kind of dark over here too. But what I'm trying to say is that one-child policy is really something that nobody liked at all. Even if you were lucky enough to survive in that era, still seeing other people around you having to suffer through that because they couldn't control it, it was just hard. It was just hard to stay nonetheless. Thankfully, the one-child policy did end, of course, which, if it kept on going, I really don't know what, like, I would have to say. Like, I would basically be disturbed. I would never really want to look at China, even if it were to continue in this time period. But it didn't, which was good. And once the one-child policy ended, they started, like, redesigning signs and, started saying, hey, you should go ahead and have 2 kids instead. Why not, though? Like, even if it feels okay to be the only child, at the same time, it's, better to not be lonely. It's better to at least, like, have someone that could also look out for you, or you can look out for them, or, to just have someone to play with and enjoy life with at the same time. That's really something, though. Like, I feel like, 2 kids isn't really that bad. I mean, like, they both have someone to keep company with at the end of the day. But yeah, overall, as a whole, we always view China as something that has very deep complexity, characterized by a mixture of admiration for such rapid technological and economic growth throughout the centuries and years that it's been around, and very significant concerns over its geopolitical ambitions in life. So it's really something that you really got to think about every now and then on, how much they come along, just like Russia too, even though that they are like seen as something that's very strong and probably more smarter than us. They do have a lot of deep background details. But yeah, with that said, that's it for our stop with China today, and it's getting really dark over here, so hold on one second. Never gets old. But yeah, with that being said, that's the end of today's episode of Brady's National Geographic. Thank you guys so much for watching, and the next episode is probably going to be about, one of the bugs or insects this time, because with these Geographic episodes, I really need some long scripts. Make sure to subscribe to National Geographic Official, our channel, so we can make it grow more. Follow our TikTok, because that's where most of our YouTube shorts come from, and the cameraman's Instagram for whatever reason. I'm not really going to dig too deep into that. With that said, I suck at endings, and no, I don't regret what I did to that wasp earlier, okay? That little bro had it. He had way too much to smoke, and, he just had it coming to him, alright? Actually, I got a little life lesson for you kids out there, alright? Kids, I know you kind of hear this, like, 100 times a day, but please don't do drugs. Because if you do, and I have a really perfect reasoning for this, you're going to end up like that wasp, okay? He had way too much to smoke, he had it coming, and now he's dead, alright? So please don't do it unless you want to end up like a wasp, which if you end up like a wasp, you're already a loser right there, and nobody wants to be a loser. Like, why would you? If you want to actually become a wasp like that, you're basically asking for it. So please don't do it, because if you do, one day you're going to end up like that, alright? I probably won't even know it's one of you viewers out there because you don't listen to me. So please, I'm warning you now, alright? Bye.